You saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. The official version was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity: a renewed pressure campaign, a familiar adversary, a promise of toughness framed as strategic resolve. The language was precise, deliberate, and confident, suggesting control. Sanctions tightened, diplomatic lines hardened. Venezuela was once again presented as a problem to be managed, a defiant outlier to be corrected through pressure and isolation. On the surface, it looked like continuity, strength, predictability. But that surface story depends on an assumption that has quietly stopped being true. The assumption is that economic punishment produces political compliance, and that geopolitical vacuums remain empty until Washington decides what should fill them. It assumes that pressure operates in a one-directional world where leverage belongs exclusively to those who impose it, and where alternatives do not form fast enough to matter. That assumption once shaped decades of U.S. foreign policy, not because it was always correct, but because the surrounding system made it appear so. Dollar dominance, institutional reach, alliance, discipline, and information control all work together to delay the visible consequences of strategic miscalculation. In the case of Venezuela, the official narrative says the objective is containment, to restrict resources, to isolate leadership, to force a reckoning. What it does not say is that isolation is not an empty state. It is an invitation, and in the modern global system, invitations are rarely ignored. As Washington narrowed its focus to punishment, others widened their focus to positioning. Financial channels that were closed from one direction opened quietly from another. Energy flows that were meant to be constrained were rerouted, discounted, reinsured, and repackaged. Political legitimacy that was supposed to erode instead found reinforcement through alternative partnerships that carried fewer conditions and longer timelines. None of this happened in a single announcement or dramatic pivot. It happened gradually through memoranda, port access agreements, currency settlements, and technology transfers that rarely make headlines. What made this shift possible was not ideological alignment, but structural opportunity. Venezuela did not need rescuing, it needed options. And in a world where power increasingly flows through supply chains, logistics, and financial architecture rather than declarations, options are influence. Each sanction designed to close a door created an incentive for someone else to build a corridor. The discomfort this creates for U.S. institutions is visible not in what they say, but in what they avoid saying. There is little discussion of permanence, little acknowledgement that once strategic ground is ceded, it is rarely recovered at the same cost it was lost. The language remains focused on pressure cycles and tactical wins, while the deeper question of system-level displacement remains largely unspoken. Who absorbs the risk when leverage no longer converts into outcomes? Who benefits when enforcement becomes selective and alternatives become normalized? And at what point does a strategy designed to signal strength begin to quietly signal something else entirely? Because beneath the headline, beneath the familiar rhetoric, something more consequential may already be underway, a reallocation of influence that does not announce itself, does not provoke immediate crisis, and does not wait for permission. And the question that now hangs unresolved is whether this shift is still unfolding or whether it has already settled into a new equilibrium that no one in Washington is prepared to name. To understand how that equilibrium began to form, it is necessary to step away from personalities and rhetoric and look instead at mechanisms. Power in the modern international system does not move primarily through speeches or press conferences. It moves through contracts, clearing systems, shipping insurance, credit lines, and technological dependencies. These are slow instruments, almost boring in their execution, but decisive in their effects. And it is precisely because they lack spectacle that they tend to escape public scrutiny until the results are already embedded. The pressure campaign against Venezuela was designed with an earlier version of this system in mind, one in which access to Western capital markets, Western insurers, and Western trade infrastructure constituted the majority of viable economic life. In that environment, exclusion functioned as a choke point, but the system has been changing for years, not in a single rupture, but through layered redundancy, parallel financial channels, alternative payment mechanisms, state-backed insurers willing to absorb political risk in exchange for long-term positioning. What once looked inefficient or marginal began to look resilient. China and Russia did not move into Venezuela as an act of provocation. They moved in because the architecture allowed it and because the incentives aligned. For China, Venezuela represented energy security, diversified away from U.S., controlled routes, paid for through arrangements that bypassed dollar settlement and emphasized long horizon repayment. For Russia, it offered strategic presence, resource access, and leverage in a region long treated as geopolitically settled. Neither required ideological conversion, both required patience. What is rarely acknowledged in official discourse is that sanctions do not merely punish targets, they also train them. Over time, restricted states learn which dependencies are dangerous and which redundancies are necessary. They learn how to trade at a discount in exchange for durability. They learn how to prioritize sovereignty over efficiency. And once those adaptations are in place, reversing them becomes politically and economically costly, even if relations later improve. This creates an asymmetry that policy frameworks struggle to address. The enforcing power assumes reversibility. The adapting power assumes permanence. One plans in election cycles, the other plans in decades. And into that gap steps external actors willing to underwrite adaptation, not out of solidarity, but out of strategic foresight. The result is not a dramatic realignment, but a quiet layering of dependence. Oil fields, serviced by non-Western firms, telecommunications infrastructure built to different standards, military maintenance contracts that lock in long-term technical reliance. Each layer reduces the marginal influence of the original enforcer, not abruptly, but cumulatively. And because no single layer appears decisive on its own, the broader pattern is easy to dismiss until it is no longer optional to acknowledge. This is where institutional silence becomes meaningful. Public discussion continues to frame Venezuela as isolated, weakened, and constrained. Less attention is paid to the nature of its new connections or to how those connections alter bargaining power over time. The narrative of pressure remains intact because the alternative narrative that leverage has been partially outsourced to competitors is far more destabilizing. Who benefits from this silence is not difficult to trace. It protects reputations. It preserves the appearance of strategic coherence. It delays accountability, but who absorbs the cost is less. Visible future policymakers inheriting diminished influence, regional actors navigating a more macro, crowded power environment, and workers whose economic exposure shifts with little warning as supply chains quietly realign. The uncomfortable tension then is not whether China and Russia have gained ground in Venezuela. It is whether the system that enabled that gain was misread from the start and whether the same mechanisms are already operating elsewhere, beyond the frame of the current headline, beyond the reach of a strategy still speaking the language of control while operating in a world that has learned how to route around it. And if that is the case, the question that remains unanswered is how many other pressure campaigns are quietly producing the same unintended architecture, even as their official assessments continue to insist that nothing fundamental has changed. There is a tendency in political analysis to treat geography as static, as if proximity alone determines relevance. Latin America, in this framing, is assumed to remain within a familiar strategic orbit simply because it has been there before. This assumption is rarely stated explicitly, but it underlies much of the confidence with which policy is made. The Western Hemisphere is imagined as stable terrain, where influence may fluctuate but never truly migrate. Yet influence does not obey maps. It follows access, reliability, and perceived inevitability. Venezuela occupies a particular position in this mental landscape. It is often described as marginal, dysfunctional, or exhausted. Its economic collapse presented as proof of limited strategic value. But this view confuses internal fragility with external insignificance. What Venezuela represents is not strength in isolation, but connectivity. It is energy reserves, Atlantic access, proximity to U.S., trade routes, and symbolic presence in a region long treated as politically settled. For actors seeking to test the permeability of American influence, it is an instructive sight. China's engagement in Venezuela has been careful, almost understated. It avoids the language of alliance and instead emphasizes development, infrastructure, and technical cooperation. These are not neutral terms. Infrastructure is permanence disguised as assistance. A port, a rail line, a telecommunications network is not easily reversed without cost. And once embedded, it shapes the flow of future decisions. Each project becomes a sunk cost that reorients incentives, not just for governments, but for domestic stakeholders who begin to rely on its continuity. Russia's involvement operates differently. It is less expansive, more pointed, focused on leverage rather than integration. Military cooperation, energy sector partnerships, and symbolic deployments are designed to signal optionality. They remind Washington that space, once considered uncontested, is, in fact, conditional. This is not about replacing U.S. influence wholesale. It is about diluting it, complicating it, making every future move more expensive and less predictable. What makes this shift difficult to confront is that it does not resemble the confrontations of the past. There are no dramatic regime changes, no ideological crusades, no formal alliances announced with fanfare. Instead, there is accumulation. Influence builds through repetition, through reliability, in moments when traditional partners are perceived as inflexible or punitive. Over time, these relationships normalize. They cease to appear exceptional and begin to define the baseline. This normalization has consequences that extend beyond Venezuela. Regional governments observe how pressure is applied, how alternatives are offered, and how costs are distributed. They draw conclusions not from official statements, but from outcomes. If diversification reduces vulnerability, it becomes rational. If engagement with non-Western powers carries fewer public conditions, it becomes attractive. And once enough actors make these calculations independently, the regional system begins to tilt without any single decision ever appearing decisive. The media treatment of this evolution tends to flatten it. Coverage oscillates between crisis, narratives, and neglect, rarely lingering on structural transformation. This is not accidental. Structural change resists simple framing. It does not provide clear villains or heroes. It implicates systems rather than individuals, and systems are more difficult to hold accountable. Silence, in this context, functions as a stabilizer for existing narratives, even as reality moves underneath them. The deeper question is not whether Venezuela has chosen new partners. Choice implies agency unconstrained by structure. The more unsettling reality is that structure itself is shifting and that the range of viable options is expanding in ways that reduce the marginal importance of any single external actor once that expansion occurs. Attempts to reassert exclusivity appear less like leadership and more like friction. What remains unresolved at the end of this chapter is whether this process has reached a tipping point. At what moment does diversification become displacement? At what point does assumed influence become aspirational? And how long can a strategy built on geographic inevitability persist in a system where reliability, not proximity, increasingly defines power? Economic influence, when it works, is invisible. It manifests not as coercion, but as default. Transactions clear without question. Supply chains function without contingency planning. Payment systems are assumed to be neutral, technical, and apolitical. The moment they become explicitly political, they lose part of their power. This is the paradox at the heart of modern sanctions regimes, and it is one that has become increasingly difficult to manage.